Well, yesterday in our saga, we came to the point where Ptolemy VI attacked Antiochus IV and was not only defeated but captured. And so Ptolemy VI becomes a prisoner of Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. And remember what relationship there was between Ptolemy VI and Antiochus IV? What was their relationship?
Wasn't Ptolemy the sixth his nephew?
Exact. Ptolemy VI is the nephew of Antiochus IV. Why? Because his mother is Cleopatra, who is the sister of Antiochus IV. Okay, we got that? I know. It's hard enough to keep track of who these people are, but when they all have the same name, it makes it more difficult, maybe, I don't know. But at least if I say, well, who was the member of the Ptolemy family, you could say Antiochus, and it might be right most of the time, who knows. All right, so that's the situation we found yesterday. Now, we're looking at, in Daniel 11, verse 27, as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil. So who are the both kings? Ptolemy VI and Antiochus IV. So both kings are trying to be deceptive with one another. Got that? Evil in their hearts. And they will speak lies to each other at the same table. All right, so if they're speaking lies to one another at the same table, what might that indicate to us? If they're at the same table.
They're in the same family.
And what are they doing?
Eating.
Eating together. That means they're in the same place, right? And we know that that's true because he's been captured. So they're eating together. But while they're eating together, what is it? Antiochus IV is pretending to be protecting Ptolemy VI. Ptolemy VI is pretending to get along with Uncle Antiochus. But they're both lying to each other. They are related after all. All right, let's look over historically what's happening. The young king, Ptolemy the seventh Philometor, I think that must be supposed to be sixth. Misprinted my notes. Was Antiochus Epiphanes' own nephew, for his mother Cleopatra was Antiochus Epiphanes' sister. All right, we talked about that. Antiochus Epiphanes then took his young nephew to Syria, which is where the Seleucids' home base was, remember, and pretended to befriend him. But neither uncle nor nephew trusted each other. Both kings pretended to be friends, but peace was never realized, for they both were deceptive. At this turn of events, that is, with Ptolemy being captured by Uncle Antiochus, that leaves Egypt without a ruler, because their ruler is up in Syria, under guard. So what happens? The Egyptians gave up hope of regaining their king and decided to appoint his younger brother, Physcon, as king in his place. So they said, all right, Ptolemy's gone, we need a king, let's go to his younger brother, and he'll be our king. Makes sense, right, normally? On learning of this, Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes, craftily intervened on behalf of Ptolemy the seventh Philometor, I think it's Ptolemy the sixth, his royal prisoner, and mounted an expeditionary force against Physcon's government in order to reestablish Philometor on his throne, now as Antiochus's ally rather than as his adversary. So, what's going on? Egypt says, we need a king, so they appointed Physcon as their king, younger brother. Antiochus Epiphanes says, whoa, hold on there. That's not what I had in mind. And so he says to his nephew, Ptolemy, look, your brother's taken over. Let's go get your throne back. You and I, best buds, we'll go get your throne back. But what's his real goal?
He's a throne for himself.
Yeah, he's really going to take over. And so he goes down with Ptolemy to recapture the throne of Egypt on behalf of Ptolemy, being a good uncle that he is, right? So, as the price of his help in expelling Physcon, Antiochus made a treaty of friendship and alliance with Philometor, aimed at obtaining a foothold in Egypt itself, and ultimately uniting the two kingdoms under his own authority. All right, so he's going to try to put them all together under him. The seriousness of this aim is attested by the issue of coinage. In other words, how do we know that he was serious about wanting to take over Egypt? We can tell by the coins that he minted. The coins that he minted bore the same types as the corresponding Ptolemaic coinage. In other words, they were made just like the coins were made in Egypt under the Ptolemies, but there's a difference. The coins had the legend King Antiochus, God manifest, or Epiphanes, rather than the usual Egyptian Ptolemy the king. So he minted coins to be used in Egypt with his image on them, not Ptolemy's. Even though these coins were found up in Seleucid territory, it's obvious that he was intending to use them down in Egypt. So we know what his intentions were. He was intending to be the ruler over Egypt. Let's go down to verse 28 then. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. All right, returning to his own land with plunder. Look what it says. Antiochus' campaign to annex Egypt to his domains ended, and Antiochus carried great wealth back to his homeland. So he was able to go down to Egypt and drive off Physcon, put Ptolemy back in place, but he still doesn't have total control. But he is able to gather a bunch of wealth from there and takes it back home with him. So he kind of plunders Egypt. But he doesn't like what's going on among the Jewish people because he wants them to be what? Greek. He wants to Hellenize them. And they're not doing it. Even though he took a bribe of Menelaus to be the new high priest and is supposed to bring them in, it's not happening. And so he's really upset with them. So he comes back from Egypt, wasn't able to accomplish everything he wanted to there. And so he comes back, and his heart is against the Holy Covenant. Notice what happens. He took out his frustration of not conquering all of Egypt on the Jews by desecrating and looting the temple in Jerusalem. Eventually he opposed, that is, set his heart against, the entire Mosaic system. That's what the Holy Covenant is the covenant of Moses, the Old Testament system, the sacrificial system. After desecrating the temple, he returned to his own country, which we see there in verse 28. Now, this is part of the prophecy that Daniel gave us, in that we had the four horns, which represent the four different generals of those who served under Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire. And out of one of those horns, it says there was a little horn. Well, the big horn is Seleucus. The little horn is Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. And so he is the prophecy of that. And we I know that by looking at history, but Josephus, the Jewish historian, says this. Indeed, it so came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision and what he wrote years before, they came to pass. No prophecy has ever been more accurately fulfilled than this. What's Josephus saying? He's saying just what we're seeing here, that what Daniel wrote came to pass so clearly that you can't deny it. You can't deny that this is what Daniel was writing about. All right? So, here we are, going down to verse, we're about to go to verse 29, but let's look over on the historical side first. Later on, however, Antiochus' alliance with Philometor wore so thin that his reestablished protege decided to make peace with Ptolemy Physcon, his defeated brother. because he thought he needed his help in dislodging Antiochus' troops from the border fortress of Pelusium. All right, so what's that saying? That Ptolemy and Antiochus didn't get along very well. And it came to the point where Ptolemy realized, I want to get Antiochus' troops out of Egypt. In order to do that, I need to make peace with my brother that we drove out. And together, we can gather enough forces to drive out Uncle Antiochus. You follow? Does that make sense? So he's getting his brother on his side. All right, let's see what happens. Verse 29. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south. But this last time, it will not turn out the way it did before. All right, so look over to the right. Having made Physcon his associate king, Ptolemy, Philometor, was able to raise a considerable armed force for the expulsion of the Seleucid army. He's kicking his uncle's troops out. But no sooner did Epiphanes learn of this development than he again marched against Egypt. Okay, so Antiochus Epiphanes hears about the fact that his two nephews are trying to drive his troops out of Egypt, and so he says, wait a minute, I'm going to go down there and stop that, and so he marches back down to Egypt, intending to subdue it once and for all. Now, verse 30 comes into play. It doesn't turn out the way it did before. Why? Verse 30, for ships of Kittim will come against him. Well, that's not obscure, though. Ships of Kittim, what is that? All right, let's look over and see. Near the city of Alexandria, 169 and 168 BC. This effort was forestalled by the intervention of the Roman fleet, which had been hurriedly dispatched to Alexandria from Crete in response to the urgent request of the embattled Ptolemies. So what it's saying is, Kittim is another word for Crete. And so what happened is, the Ptolemies down here cry out to Rome for help. Help us! Our uncle's going to come and kill us. And so the ships of Kittim or Crete are Roman ships that come down to help stop Antiochus Epiphanes from defeating his nephews and taking over Egypt. Everybody follow? You see what's going on? Anybody lost? Okay. Next. The aggressive Roman commander Popilius Laenas met Antiochus, marshaling his hosts for a siege of Alexandria. So in other words, Antiochus has come down and he's going to lay siege to Alexandria. He's surrounding it because that's apparently where the nephews are. Maybe that was where their capital was at this time. And the Roman land and the Roman general intervenes here. And it says that inform him that the Roman government ordered him to quit Egypt immediately or face the consequences of war with Rome. Rome says you need to leave Egypt, get out of Egypt, and stay out. Now, did Antiochus Epiphanes have any experience with Rome that he would know that it might be a good idea for him to leave? Some of you are saying no, some saying yes. Yes, he did. Two things. Where was Antiochus Epiphanes raised? Do you remember? In Rome. Remember, he was one of the hostages that was taken when his father Antiochus the Great was defeated by Rome. So he has two experiences. One, he was raised in Rome, and two, he knew what it meant for his father to try to go against Rome, and was utterly defeated, massacred. Right? So, does he have enough information from his experience in the past to make a good decision here? Yeah. Still, he wavered. He wanted Egypt. He's not sure that he's willing to give up that easily. Notice what happens. Drop down to, it did not take Antiochus very long to give way before this mandate, especially after Popilius drew a circle around him with his staff and ordered him to make his decision before he stepped outside it. So Antiochus maybe is saying, okay, give me some time to think about this. how about if I go back to my tent and reflect a while? And Popilius says, take all the time you want, drawing a circle around him. But you've got to decide before you leave this circle. Does that put the pressure on?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Antiochus has to give in. What choice does he have, right? Going against the Romans. And not being given very much of an opportunity to do anything else. All right, so he gives in. How does that make Antiochus Epiphanes feel?
Defeated.
He feels defeated, humiliated, right? Because, I mean, think about what his plans were. His plans were to unite all the Seleucid territory with the Ptolemaic territory and to become the ruler of this great empire. And things are kind of on track. You know, he's got his nephew down there in Egypt. Okay, the two nephews got together, but that's okay. He can take care of them. He can get down there and finish it once and for all and take over Egypt. You see the big plans he's got? But what happens? When he gets there, the Romans have arrived. And they say, nah, all your plans, forget it. Get out of here. And so he's got to go back home, as the expression goes, with his tail between his legs. So he's not feeling really very chipper at this point. He's feeling very humiliated, maybe even depressed. Now all his plans are going down the tubes. So have you ever had a bad day and you get home and you take it out on somebody else? Sometimes the dog gets it, right? You ever kick the dog because you had a bad day? No, some of you would never do that. Maybe you yell at a sibling or you yell at your parent. We've all done something like that, right? Well, Antiochus Epiphanes has had a bad day. And so who's he going to take it out on? Who doesn't he like anyway? The Jews, right? So that's what he's going to do. All right, let's see what happens here. Notice at the end of verse 30 it says that he will be disheartened. You know, that's kind of what we've been saying. He's depressed, he's humiliated. So over there in the historical part, you see the year 169. Antiochus, following his bitter disappointment in Egypt, went and encamped. Oops, I forgot. I looked at the head of the next slide. I forgot to show you the picture of the coins that he made of himself for use in Greece. All right, now let's go here to year 169. Antiochus, following his bitter disappointment in Egypt, went and encamped near Jerusalem. He had a score to settle with Jason, first of all, because in his absence, Jason heard that Antiochus had died in Egypt, and so he thought, this is a good time for me to get rid of Menelaus and take over. And that's what he did. He had organized a regiment of 1,000 armed supporters for a coup d'etat, as a takeover. He massacred a large number of citizens and shut Menelaus up in the Jerusalem citadel. Hearing of this, Antiochus decided to suppress the Jewish religion altogether. He said, all right, I've had enough of this Jewish religion. I'm going to be done with it. This is going to be it. I'm going to get rid of it altogether. And to exact stern reprisal from those who had taken up arms against his government. All right, look back over at Daniel. And it says he will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. That's what he did. He marched into Jerusalem on a Sabbath with overwhelming forces, released Menelaus, and conducted a massacre in which 80,000 men, women, and children were put to the sword. Can you imagine that? He went into Jerusalem and with his soldiers and just massacred, killed 80,000 people. It doesn't matter if they're men, women, or children. What an evil man. Then, we'll go back over to verse 30, or end of verse 30. He will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So we're going to see that. He's going to show regard. He's going to accept those Jewish people who say, we're done with Judaism will become Greek. Verse 31, and forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, that's the temple, and do away with the regular sacrifice. They will set up the abomination of desolation. All right, look over at the history. So he marched in Jerusalem, massacred 80,000 people. Then he profaned the temple, performing a pagan sacrifice to Zeus in the temple and erecting an altar to Zeus over the altar of burnt offering. So what's he do? He goes into the temple and he erects an altar to Zeus. Eventually, he's going to put a statue of Zeus in there as well. And here's a picture of the statue of Zeus at Olympus, and probably similar to what he would put there in Jerusalem. On Kislev 25, in the year 167 BC, the abomination of desolation was set up on the altar of burnt offering outside the holy place, having a pig offered on the altar. So, what's the significance of offering a pig?
A pagan. Oh, wait.
I'm sorry, Ryan?
It is unclean.
A pig is considered unclean by the Jewish people. And so to offer a pig on the altar was to make the whole altar unusable. So that's what he's done. Now, notice what he does next. The Jews are required to make obeisance to it. So he made the Jews there bow down to this pig on the altar. He then forced the priests to swallow its flesh. He made them eat pig, which was totally forbidden for the Jewish people. What did that do? Because the priests are eating pig, what's that do to them?
Makes them unclean.
Makes them unclean. They can never be someone offering sacrifice to God again. They've been made unclean. Notice what he does next. He made a broth out of it. Pig juice. Pig gravy. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. And sprinkled the entire temple. He splashed this all over the temple. What does that do to the temple?
Makes it unclean.
Makes it unclean. He knew what he was doing. He's trying to destroy the entire Jewish religion. And by making everything ceremonially unclean, he almost accomplishes that very thing. In these acts, Antiochus was accompanied by the despicable Menelaus, who assisted in robbing the temple of its golden vessels and other sacred objects valued at 1,800 talents. Antiochus also demolished the city walls and a military garrison was established. Not only did Antiochus enthrone himself for adoration by the Jews as he sat in the court of the desecrated Jerusalem temple, so he sat right there in the temple and said, okay, everybody, I want you to worship me. But he also claimed divine honors for himself on every major coin that he minted. He vented his fury against the Holy Covenant, the entire Mosaic system, favoring any renegade Jews who turned to help him. He desecrated the temple and abolished the daily sacrifice. Antiochus promised apostate Jews, that is, Jews who turned against their Judaism, great reward if they would set aside the God of Israel and worship Zeus, the god of Greece. Notice verse 32. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. Wow. This is extremely upsetting, isn't it? That this man would do these things. Well, let's continue on. All throughout Israel, altars to Jupiter or Zeus were set up, and the Jews were forced to sacrifice on them. The Jews who refused to submit to Antiochus' false religious system were persecuted and martyred for their faith. The officers charged with carrying out these commands did so with great rigor. In other words, they were excited about it. They liked doing it. A veritable inquisition was established with monthly sessions for investigation. Appropriately, with a play on words, Antiochus Epiphanes, God manifest, was called by the Greek historian Polybius Epiphanes, madman. Antiochus sent his general Apollonius with 22,000 soldiers into Jerusalem on what was purported to be a peace mission. He first entered Jerusalem amicably, then suddenly turned upon the defenseless city, murdering, plundering, and burning through its length and breadth. The men were butchered, women and children sold into slavery, and in order to give permanence to the work of desolation, the walls of numerous houses were torn down. And that's something we already talked about. That goes back earlier. So he's now made Jerusalem into a Greek colony. The king's attention was then turned to the destruction of the national religion. A royal decree proclaimed the abolition of the Jewish mode of worship. Sabbaths and festivals were not to be observed. Circumcision was not to be performed. The sacred books were to be surrendered, and the teaching of the Torah to be terminated. And the Jews were compelled to offer sacrifices of swine to the idols that had been erected. If these activities were not observed, the whole family was put to death. When they found babies that had been circumcised, they hung them around their mothers' necks, and the women were thrown from the walls of the cities. Copies of Torah were confiscated and burned at monthly inspections. 90-year-old scribe Eleazar was brought before Antiochus and commanded to eat swine's flesh. Refusing, soldiers asked him to bring his own lawful meat and eat it as if it were the detestable pork. We don't care if you really eat pork, just pretend like you're eating pork. Because they wanted everybody else to see this old scribe disobeying God's law. After an eloquent statement of faith, he remained unmoved, not willing to deceive the young people with his example. With that, the soldiers beat him mercilessly until he died. A woman named Hannah was arrested, along with her 7 sons. This is how she counseled them. I cannot tell how you came into my womb, for I neither gave you breath nor life, neither was it I that formed the members of every one of you, members referring to your limbs. But doubtless the Creator of the world, who formed the generation of man and found out the beginning of all things, will also of his own mercy give you breath and life again, as you now regard not your own selves for his law's sake. What's she saying? I'm the one who gave you breath to begin with. If you give your life for him now, he will bring you back to life. There's a resurrection someday. Well, one by one, they were tortured for refusing to eat swine flesh. Still refusing, they were boiled alive in cauldrons, big pots. When one son was approached to apostatize or have his tongue and hands cut off, he courageously testified, "These I had from heaven, and for his laws I despise them, and from him I hope to receive them again." Another affirmed, before he died, "It is good, being put to death by men, to look for hope from God, to be raised up again by him." As the last son was pressed to deliver himself by apostatizing, his mother encouraged him with the resurrection. She said, "I beseech you, my son, look upon the heaven and the earth, and all that is therein, and consider that God made them of things that were not, and so was mankind made likewise. Fear not this tormentor, but being worthy of your brothers, take your death, that I may receive you again in mercy with your brothers." And then finally the mother was put to death. The possession of a sacred book or the performance of the rite of circumcision was punished with death. And you can see here's an outline of the decrees recorded for us in 1 Maccabees. Sent letters all throughout that they should follow the strange laws, forbidding burnt offerings, offerings in the temple, that they should profane Sabbaths and festival days, sacrifice swine's flesh, unclean beasts. They might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And toward that end, of course, offering a pig on the altar and spreading the juice of it all throughout the temple, desecrating the temple. at the end of let's see what, verse 32, it says this, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. So true followers of God are going to be strengthened. They're going to take action. They're not going to sit back and let this happen. Look on the right. The Jews who refused to submit to Antiochus' false religious system were persecuted and martyred for their faith. But a small remnant remained faithful to God, refusing to engage in those abominable practices. This passive resistance was undertaken by people called the Hasidim, which means the pious ones, the religious ones, the pure ones, who, much to the surprise of the Hellenes, the Greeks, suffered martyrdom by the hundreds. Part of that was because they refused to fight on the Sabbath. And so it didn't take long for Antiochus and his soldiers to figure out if we attack them on the Sabbath, they're not going to resist. And so they slaughtered them by the hundreds. But those who were following God, who wanted to continue teaching God's law, despite all the threats, came up with an ingenious way of doing it. They wanted to be sure that they could continue to teach their children from the Torah. Now, one thing you could do if you wanted to accomplish that is to meet in secret, right? But if you're caught in secret, then it's pretty obvious that you're doing something wrong. Now, sometimes, and you may have seen stories like this, or read stories like this, sometimes it's best to practice deceit in plain sight. Then nobody questions what you're doing. And that's what they decided to do. Notice what they did. To continue instructing their children in the law without arousing suspicion, small groups of children gathered with their scribe in the streets, out in the open. And as Syrian soldiers approached, they hid the copy of Torah under one of the robes and produced a dreidel, pretending to be playing a game. Now, this is the origin of the dreidel. Maybe you've heard of that, you've seen it, seen pictures of it. This is one. And so they were sitting around a circle. The scribe is instructing them out in the open. They see soldiers coming. They shove the scroll underneath one of their robes. Then what explanation do they have for sitting there in a circle? Well, they're just playing a children's game. Get out the dreidel and start playing. Oh, look, they're just having fun. They're playing a game. But it was to deceive them, the soldiers, into thinking they're doing something that they weren't. So that's the dreidel. We'll talk more about the dreidel later as it comes to play in what transpires in the days to come. Let's see, this is Tuesday, so we're done at 11:17. All right, we're going to stop here and see how the resistance really comes to fruition tomorrow. Now that means tomorrow we'll not be having a quiz because we're not to that point yet. And in fact, most of the questions on the quiz will come from what we've talked about today and tomorrow. So there'll be some questions from previous things. Kind of a general nature or things that you can pick out. So hopefully we can get through what the rebellion that's going to occur tomorrow and then have a quiz on Thursday. All right, in the meantime, look over your materials and try to acquaint yourselves with the basic things that are happening here. Any questions?